So you've been studying world history all year long, and the AP test is right around the corner. And I have a feeling that all of these empires and people and events are getting a little mixed up in your head. Quite frankly, that's the struggle with learning world history chronologically. We start with some foundation and learn about some events that happened in a region before 1200. Then we move into the next historical period of the course up to 1450 and whip around all those regions again. And then again in 1750, and then up to 1900 and into the 21st century. All that knowledge is being thrown around at your brain, and it just feels like you are at an amusement park, maybe like you're riding the Scrambler or the Tilt-A-Whirl, and you just can't keep it all straight. Now, I'm Steph Gerges, or Mrs. Gerges, in the classroom, and I want to help you organize all of this information by region from the beginning of the course to the end. So let's start in China, as I feel like this is the region where most students struggle, and it's a heavy hitter on the AP test. As AP World Modern starts in 1200, we do start the Chinese story kind of midway through. So it is a little bit necessary for us to back the train up and get a little context on the Song Dynasty. I still teach my students the Chinese Dynasty song, set to the tune of Frere Jacques, which I'm not going to sing, but for the AP test, the first lines of the song, Shengzhou Qin Han, don't actually make the cut for our course, but their legacy does. The short version is that China is really large, and we will see them constantly struggle to be unified in one large empire. And you will see that there are a variety of philosophies that will help guide Chinese political and social thought on this, but the big ones are important to know, and that's legalism and Confucianism. There's a cyclical nature of Chinese history where you'll find these short legalistic dynasties that unify the land and then are followed by these longer golden ages. This happens with the short legalistic Qin dynasty, followed by a long golden age of the Han dynasty guided by Confucian values. In AP World, there are 4 major time periods which will help us kind of chunk the information and global events in your brain. We pick up the course in the year 1200, the era of state building and the expansion of trade networks, and the Song dynasty is who is in control. They, like their Han and Tang predecessors, are highly focused on Confucian values, which dictate how society should function. There are 5 key relationships which describe the specific duties and how one should act, and this creates order. The concept of filial piety, or the respect for elders, is a virtue that is built into the DNA of Chinese society, which is all about correct behavior, obedience to hierarchy, and ethics. The Song dynasty has been in control since 960. Song Taizu, the founder, used military might to conquer and unifying neighboring states. He then doubled down on Confucianism and the order it can bring if you focus on educating elites that would then work in the government. This created a very large imperial bureaucracy within China and the expanded use of the civil service exam. Plus, the Song state grew into a very powerful and commercially successful empire as it focused on trade along the Silk Road, which we learned about in Unit 2. One key to that stability came from the spread of champa rice into China from Vietnam. This fast-growing and drought-resistant rice allowed for stability in their food sources. And as we've talked about in my AP class or in AP World ISM, more food, more people. Silk Road trade plus the Grand Canal, which connected kind of the northern parts and southern parts of China, allowed for a more connected economy to share both agricultural products but also those other trade goods as well. They were known for their porcelain, like China, and silk, and also for their paper making and their woodblock printing, which allowed for the spread of learning of arts and literature as well during the Song dynasty. Plus, we'll see how gunpowder also spread from the Song dynasty into the rest of the world, which will also change history. This made the Song dynasty one of the most advanced societies in the period of 1200 to 1450. They also had these artisans or skilled craft workers, even producing steel from iron way back pre-Industrial Revolution in China, which was mentioned multiple times in the course and exam description for this course, and gets mentioned in my class basically never, except for right now. Now, it's important to note that while Confucianism is the predominant cultural belief system, Taoism and Buddhism were also very important in China. By the time of the Song dynasty, Neo-Confucianism emerged, which is more of this syncretic blend of traditional Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. However, the Song dynasty will come to an end as they are conquered by the Mongols in the 1200s, and they will establish a new dynasty known as the Yuan dynasty. One of the grandsons of Chinggis Khan, Kublai Khan, took the role of an emperor of China and claimed the mandate of heaven. Kublai allowed for religious tolerance to unite the land and help add to the existing infrastructure in China. He built things like roads. Oppressed religious groups like Buddhists and Taoists and Muslims and even Christians liked Kublai. However, his policies enraged the ethnic Chinese majority. It felt like his policies really kind of uprooted their culture, which is true because they were outside beliefs. Under Mongol rule, they even imported foreigners from the Middle East and from Russia to work in their government positions, as their large bureaucracy was not something really that the Mongolian Empire was familiar with. This negated Chinese traditions of the civil service exam, which again caused some problems. By 1368, a new dynasty rose up and eliminated the Mongol rule in China. This dynasty was known as the Ming, and you could easily put the Ming in the same category as the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties, as it had significant amount of continuities. It had a strong centralized government system based on Confucian principles, and the civil service exam was brought back to create a path to government positions based on merit versus family background or money. It also was very much a golden age, and it was the era of arts and iconic porcelain. This will shift us into the next historical period of our course, the years of 1450 to 1750, the era of large land-based empires and the rise of maritime empires. The Ming will rise in 1368, but will last until 1644. In this era of land and maritime empires, Emperor Yanglei is one of the key leaders to remember. He was the third emperor of the Ming dynasty. He will build the Forbidden City in Beijing, and it will change that to be the capital city. He will also begin to sponsor naval expeditions in Southeast Asia, India, and even the Swahili coast of Africa. Let's remember this is a time that really shaped exploration, and the Chinese were involved initially. Zheng He was a Chinese navigator who's led some major fleets, larger than even the fleets of Da Gama or Columbus. After Yanglei's death, though, the expeditions in the Indian Ocean ended, and China kind of went back to being a little more isolated during this time. But it's important to note here that while the Chinese stopped exploring, they still were exporting so many of their goods, and silver was coming in large numbers from Mexico and Peru. 30 to 40% of that silver was coming to China. But why, you might ask? Because Europeans wanted Chinese goods like silk and porcelain, and later, tea, which maybe you never really made that connection. The idea that British tea is highly connected to the British East India Company and their involvement in Indian China. Regardless, silver and money from Europe is still flooding into China. However, like all great things, the Ming dynasty began to decline. Economic issues due to inflation and all that silver flooding into China and massive population growth, the Chinese lacked the food to keep up. Starvation and famines caused unrest in the land. As I say, when people are hangry, it always leads to fighting. Now, peasant revolts erupted in 1644, and they reached out to the Qing warriors to help put down these peasant revolts. Well, assisted indeed they did. And they overthrew the Ming dynasty and established the Qing dynasty. Now, the Qing dynasty will last from 1644 all the way to 1911 as our final Chinese dynasty, which will bring us into the next two historical periods. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Qing emerged during the era of land and maritime empires. And a key difference between the Qing and the Ming would be the fact that the Qing were not ethnically Chinese. They were Manchus from Manchuria. They forbid intermarriage between Chinese and Manchus. Men were required to adopt the Manchu Q hairstyle, which was an outsider tradition forced upon the ethnic Chinese. And this was to show their loyalty. And if they refused the hairstyle, they could be executed. But in other manners, the Qing dynasty looked very much like other Chinese dynasties and adopted many parts of Chinese culture. Ethnic Chinese were involved in the government, and the civil service exam was still utilized as they looked for the most talented individuals, regardless of their ethnicity or their wealth, to work in government positions. Manchu emperors claimed the mandate of heaven and were very well versed in Confucian philosophy. Emperor Kangxi and his successor Qianlong were both scholars of Confucianism. They supported the arts, and both extended the expanse of the Qing dynasty, and will open trade up with some Europeans, but limit how and what was allowed into their country. They kept many Europeans, like the Portuguese, to a few ports like Macau, and placed legal restrictions against people from spreading or converting to Christianity from these European influences. Now, the Qing dynasty continues as we go into the next time period of 1750 to 1900. Now, remember, the rest of the world in this era is focused on political revolutions and the Industrial Revolution, but China will be perfectly content to not challenge the status quo. Yet. China wanted stability, order, and security, and were able to do this for major parts of history. However, that's about to change. The British were looking for new markets for their manufactured goods and were looking at China. The Emperor Qianlong responded to King George III. Yes, that King George III. You'll be back, King George III. Well, Qianlong tells him that there was no need for their British goods in China. So, what did the British do? Challenge accepted. They became drug dealers. And I'm not even kidding. They started to sell opium illegally to the Chinese and were quite successful. The Qing then confiscated and burned their stash, which then really upset the British. Driven by profits, they pushed in with their advanced weapons, perks of the Industrial Revolution, and were able to push up the river and overtake the city. The series of battles from this event was known as the Opium Wars, and it resulted with the Treaty of Nanjing, an unequal treaty that the Chinese were forced to sign. The Qing were required to pay Britain a lot of money for their lost stash of drugs that they were selling illegally. And not only that, they then had to increase the number of ports that the British could trade from 1 to 5. It also, strangely enough, gave British citizens extraterritoriality, which basically exempted them from following Chinese law when they were in China. All of these events will lead many Chinese to feeling like the days of the Qing are over. This was one of those driving forces of the Taiping Rebellion. The influence of Europeans in China and the Opium War losses were just too much. Overall, the Taiping Rebellion was a largely peasant uprising caused by the lack of food, lack of jobs, and overwhelmingly impoverished lives that the Chinese were stuck within. Add in the opium dens and the lack of opportunities for the common person to really have upward mobility because of the civil service exam. People were just upset. They wanted the Manchus out. They wanted European influences out. And at the end of the day, who stepped up to defend the Qing dynasty from crumbling? Europeans, the British and the French, who both benefited from the relationship they had with the Qing dynasty and with the Treaty of Nanjing. In many ways, the Taiping Rebellion laid the groundwork for the revolution that will occur under Mao Zedong. But let's not forget, there was yet another anti-imperialist group that arose during this time period known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or the Boxers. They would look nothing like that. But the Boxers would attack Westerners and Christians and missionaries. They were not very successful, but yet, once again, you can see the resistance from Chinese people to outside influences. They're actually really good at martial arts. I thought they could dodge bullets. Once again, this is just another example of people turning to their religious or cultural beliefs to stand up against force within their country that was denying them rights. However, the days of the Qing dynasty is numbered, and this will lead us into the final period of our course, 1900 to present. You know, in this time period, you learned about the World Wars and the Cold War. But before we get to either of those, we first must start with the revolution of Sun Yat-sen, who really birthed the Chinese Republic. The dynastic system, which had we've seen for like 2,000 years, ends with the Chinese Republic in 1911. It's not going to last that long, so don't get too used to the Republic stage. Sun Yat-sen was actually a Christian, but believed that China should be guided by Confucian principles of loyalty and respect for ancestors and democratic reforms and overcoming economic inequities of land distribution and wealth. Sun Yat-sen appointed Chiang Kai-shek to lead the military and work alongside the nationalists known as the Kuomintang. A quick aside, China will support the Triple Entente with their ties to the British during World War I. They will not be heavily involved in the fighting, but will support by sending laborers to assist with the war effort all the way to Europe. By 1925, Sun Yat-sen passed away from cancer, and Chiang Kai-shek took over as leader of the nationalists. However, something new was brewing at this time. Well, two things: communism and Japanese imperialism. And what would be more of a threat to the new republic? Well, Japanese imperialism was a threat, and so much of a threat that an uncommon alliance of the communists in China and the nationalists forming an alliance to fight together against the Japanese. Japan will actually invade Manchuria and northern China back in 1931, 8 years before World War II will really begin. The Chinese will officially be on the side of the Allies with the common enemy of the Japanese. We can remember the awful, awful ways in which the Japanese targeted the Chinese in 1937 in what is called the Nanking Massacre, as Japanese troops launched a campaign of atrocities against the civilians of China with mass rape campaigns and the butchering of an estimated 150,000 male prisoners of war. World War II will end in Asia with the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan. In China, we will see resuming the civil war between the communists and the nationalists. The Chinese Communist Party gained a lot of peasant support because of their land distribution policies, their new schools and the hospitals that they opened, and overall how they were successful against fighting against the Japanese. Meanwhile, the nationalists were seen as kind of corrupt and ineffective in the war effort. By 1949, the communists will win in this civil war, and they will establish the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. Mao and the CCP will set out to have China catch up industrially and followed the Soviet model of 5-year plans. Remember how before we talked about this, that China wasn't really getting on the bandwagon successfully of the Industrial Revolution. So they're going to buckle down and industrialize. And Mao, with his most famous initiative, was called the Great Leap Forward, which was not great, nor did it really leap China forward. Essentially, Mao tried to increase agricultural production through the collectivization of farms into what is called communes. But there's a series of famines that put production severely behind, and Mao didn't want to act as though his plan was not working, so he continued to export grain as if it indeed was successful, which led to 20 million people dying of starvation. Mao also led the Cultural Revolution, which indeed was revolutionary, as it was basically the opposite of everything we've learned about so far in Chinese culture. We've talked about filial piety, respect for elders, studying Confucian classics, education. But instead, Mao did, again, the opposite. Instead, he tried to appeal to the younger generation and did basically the opposite of all those concepts. He had his Red Guards, which were students who denounced their teachers, their employers, and their parents, and were told to tear down tradition, which in this case was Confucian tradition. There were often mass gatherings where older people were being taunted and bullied as they represented the old way of life in China. Many adults were sent off to labor camps to get re-educated, and if it didn't work, they would be killed. Targeting like your grandmas and your grandpas, it's just not cool. So let's remember to throw in here that the Cold War was going on during this time period and was not really that cold in Asia. China will then support North Korea by sending thousands of communist Chinese troops to support against the counterattacks of the United States in South Korea. Additionally, we'll send troops and over $20 billion to the North Vietnamese as they fought against the United States in what we call the Vietnam War. After Mao's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping takes control. He was more moderate and brought China into the international trading system, which normalized relationships with the United States. Deng will be open to economic liberalization and economic growth in China, which the last time I checked was wildly successful, as it feels like so many of our consumer goods are made in China today. The idea of forgoing economic equity across China was also really a big shift. Collectivization communes ended with peasants leasing lots of land where surplus could then be sold for a profit. Foreign businesses were allowed to be established in China, which led to massive globalization, which we learned about in Unit 9. This will be tricky, as many people believe that the opening of economic reforms should also lead to the political reforms against the communist government. But that was not on the table. This will lead to the uprising in Tiananmen Square, where demonstrators called for democracy and free speech, and were met with a crackdown by the government. So what will be the future of China? Today, it is still communist, and it is heavily involved in global trade. In fact, it is the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history. You'll also find there's a significant amount of censorship and limits on free speech in China. In fact, you know what you will not find in China? The country with the largest population in the world? They do not have access to the world's biggest social media sites, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all blocked. However, they do have their own versions, which are regulated by the Chinese government. They have Weibo, which is like Twitter, Renren, their version of Facebook, and Youku, which is like YouTube, and WeChat, which I would compare to like WhatsApp or Messenger. Now, they hosted the Winter Olympics in 2022 amidst the continued coronavirus pandemic. In fact, China has been proud of their coronavirus response, as they have been really strict about lockdowns and really at the cost of freedoms, but to this day have a much lower death rate overall. When this video was made, they had under 5,000 deaths for the entire pandemic. In comparison, the United States had over 900,000 deaths, nearing 1 million. On today's date. Yes, we can take into account a lot of different factors that shape those numbers, balancing of freedoms, censorship, but overall, Xi Jinping, China's leader, has repeatedly pointed out that the country was successful at containing the coronavirus as proof of their superiority of its governance model, kind of like a +1 for communism. So there you have it, an overview of China from the beginning of the course to the end. So let's break it down pretty fast. There's the Song Dynasty, Confucian Golden Age, highly commercialized along the Silk Road. Yuan Dynasty, conquered by the Mongols, claimed the mandate of heaven. Ming, back to Confucianism, more commercialization, and we love the world's silver. Qing, shoot, there's outsiders again ruling China and are not ethnically Chinese, and most people are not a fan of us. Loss of the Opium Wars and 2 major rebellions, the Taiping and the Boxers, not very great, but the British are here, and there's lots of European influence. Then we get to the Republic. In 1911, the revolution with Sun Yat-sen ends the entire dynastic cycle. Communists and nationalists team up to fight against the Japanese imperialists. But when World War II is over, they resume the Civil War. Communists win, Mao is in control, great leap forward, Red Guards, we don't like Confucianism anymore, but then Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping opens the markets, wait, free markets, free democracy, just kidding, just the markets, Tiananmen Square happens, economy is massively growing, still communist, still censoring, but they have their own social media apps for that. COVID started in Wuhan, 2022, Winter Olympics in China. Whew. What's next? Only time will tell. Now, I sure hope that was helpful. If you felt like it was, hit that like button, or like my 4-year-old likes to do when people say that on YouTube, you can just throw a thumbs up in the air, which doesn't really help me, but throw a comment. Let me know what was helpful about this. Subscribe and stay along for the ride as we look at all the different regions, as we look at one place at one time, reviewing from the beginning of the course to the end. I hope this helped you learn about yesterday, better understanding today, and helping us all write a better tomorrow. Till next time, see you guys.